conversation in a month or two, something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Always happy to do stuff like this. It is the job for the DevRel folks. So
Okay,
happy to come
so
back.
so in that case, I suggest that we do start with Dino because I think it also provides better context about like why you did JSR because you didn't just do it out of the blue.
Mhm.
So
Uh,
Kevin, are you on the Deno team, Deno organization? I'm not a Node guy, so I'm not as familiar with
I
that.
Yeah.
started the
So
live stream, by the way, just so you're all aware.
Let me retweet it, by
Wait
the
a minute, I got
way.
to do my hair. Hold on.
perfect.
Is
So
it on X? If I look at our
Yes.
account, will I see it? So I'll retweet it.
Because I just started a podcast with Lucas Casonato.
yeah, Luca. Yeah, Luca's
Luca.
been kind of making the rounds as well, talking about
Yeah, on
JSR.
syntax. So
Yeah, for sure, for sure. But yeah, so I'm on the Deno team as well. I'm working on like DevRel, Docs, community programs, that kind of thing. But yeah, I've been kind of in and around JavaScript and the dev tool space for a bit
What's your handle on Twitter, by the way, Kevin?
now. Kevin Whinnery, all one word.
Oh, okay. So just a second. Ah, it's WH. Kevin Whinnery. So just a second. I'm just retweeting it.
Mhm.
Okay. Anyway, so as I said, so we'll be starting with Dino, and then we'll continue with JSR if we have time. Otherwise, we'll schedule another one for for when we all have the time.
Sounds like a
Um,
plan.
by the way, Chuck, I said before you joined, this is the first time I'm actually joining from my work, from the office, because it's
Oh,
early
cool.
enough.
Yeah, we did it way early.
Yeah, it's still light outside here, so
Yeah, we've had
usually.
some back and forth on the time. So just to clarify that, because I know you guys have been asking. So I was initially, I put it out a bunch of times, kind of got some back and forth with Steve about his stand-up meeting, settled on 9 o'clock in the morning Mountain Time anyway. And then, yeah, what wound up happening is AJ said that 9 o'clock didn't work for him after I had already had Michaela rescheduling some of the episodes. So we left this one at 9, but we're going to try and do them at 10:30, which it works out for me because if I have to schedule a lunch or something, I just tell people we can meet at 12 or 12:30.
10:30 Mountain.
Bug out. Yeah.
10:30 Mountain. Yeah, that would be better for me too.
So anyway, so that's what we're settling on. But yeah, Kevin, just to give a little more context, I'm the vice chair of the Utah County Republican Party, and I get asked out to lunch a lot. And so I needed to free up my lunch hour. So anyway,
No problem.
yeah.
By the way, lest I forget, at the end of the episode, the recording, we have a picks section where we shout out, whatever is of interest to us. It doesn't need to be technological. It can be like anything, books, movies, TV,
Mhm.
music, hobbies, whatever.
It can be tech as well.
It can be tech if you want to. It can be
Yeah.
one or more things. Usually the guest goes last, so you'll have a chance to come up with yours while you're hearing ours.
Okay.
So just start thinking about something, but there's no rush.
Okay. Got it. I have a Netflix show I've been going hard on recently, so I can
Nice.
I can do
Oh,
it.
which one? I'm curious.
It's
What?
called House of Ninjas. I won't spoil it.
Oh, I've seen it. I've seen the promos. Okay,
Yeah.
we'll talk about it
Okay.
when we get there.
All right.
Yeah,
Good.
my picks are the highlight of every episode, but you'll understand when we get there. So
Got
if you
it.
haven't listened before.
Excellent. I will look forward to it.
Okay, then I think we can start.
All right. I'll start yelling into the microphone. Hey, welcome to another episode of JavaScript Jabber. This week on our panel, we have Steve Edwards.
Since AJ's not here, I'll do him. Yo, yo, yo from very cold and rainy Portland, which is not out of the ordinary for this time of year.
Dan Shapir.
Hey from Tel Aviv, where it's still, well, actually Kfar Saba, which is also in Israel, where it's still light outside, which explains why I'm in Kfar Saba, because I'm still at the office, as you might be able to tell from my background if you're watching the stream or the recorded video. It's daylight savings in the US and not yet in Israel, which makes it even earlier for me. So yeah.
Yeah, I must say that is a very distinctive white wall and whiteboard there with nothing written on it. It stands out.
Yeah, somebody cleaned out the whiteboard, which is a good thing because it means that there are no trade secrets.
And no cookies.
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs, and I just want to say hi to all 37 people watching us on X or Twitter, whatever you're calling it. And we have a special guest this week. That's Kevin Whinnery. Kevin, do you want to say hello and introduce yourself?
Yeah, that'd be great. How's it going, folks? I'm Kevin. I'm part of the Deno team, and I'm coming to you from Minneapolis, which is not cold, actually, as it usually is. It's actually unseasonably warm for March in Minneapolis, but we'll take it. We can get a little bit more time outside without a coat.
Awesome. All right. Well, we brought you on to talk a bit about Deno, and I have to say I was a little surprised to find that we haven't had an episode where we talked specifically about Deno. I think we talked about, isn't there a web framework or something that we talked about?
We
maybe we didn't
mentioned
even do that.
Fresh. I think we mentioned Fresh,
Mhm.
and we said that we wanted to bring somebody to talk about Fresh,
be.
but I don't think we actually had an episode about Fresh either. So maybe we'll take this opportunity to also talk about Fresh.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Always happy to chat about Fresh.
I might have been confused with, I know we did an episode on Bun, so that may be.
Yeah, and
where
it
I'm
was a
getting
great
lost.
episode, by the way, even
Yeah.
though I didn't participate.
Despite the fact that there was no
Despite
Dan.
the fact, yes.
Despite the fact, yeah, it was just AJ and what's the name of the guy who's doing Bun? I forgot his name.
Probably Jared, I would imagine.
Jared, yeah, it was
Yeah.
Jared himself.
Yeah, it was Jared, I'm pretty sure.
It was a great episode. By the way.
Jared Sumner.
Highly recommended. Yes. AJ took the opportunity to really dive into the nitty-gritty details of what it means to build an engine.
That's kind of how he operates, but it makes the episodes fun, so it works. Let's jump in though and quickly introduce Deno. I know that probably most of our listeners have some idea what it is, but we always have new people, and by new people I mean like new to programming or new to JavaScript who may not know. So let's give them a baseline and we'll move up from there.
Yeah, sounds great. So Deno is a JavaScript runtime similar to Node.js or Bun, and it was originally created by Ryan Dahl, who was the author of Node.js about 10 or going on 15 years ago now. And it sort of came out of wanting to address some problems and some issues that Ryan had with Node.js originally, and some things that kind of he felt could have been done slightly better, slightly differently in a JavaScript runtime kind of built in the modern era. So Deno has support for TypeScript natively. So instead of just JavaScript code, you can use TypeScript code without any third-party tools or a build step. And for those that are brand new, TypeScript is a compiled to JavaScript language, which is strongly typed, kind of similar to a Java or a C#. And it can help by kind of surfacing compile time errors and provide type checking, and kind of makes the editing experience a little bit more on Rails in JavaScript, where you can have a predictable interface that has great IDE support and things like that. Deno also tries very hard to be as browser-like a programming environment as possible. One thing about Node.js that, as it was originally created, a lot of the web standard APIs that we enjoy in the browser today didn't exist. So there wasn't really a module system for creating reusable code. So Node.js had CommonJS, which is a older module format that has since been superseded by ECMAScript modules. There were, no file system APIs. There was no built-in HTTP request API like the fetch API that we have in the browser today. So Deno, wherever possible, tries to implement browser APIs to expose functionality instead of inventing kind of new APIs whenever possible. And another thing with the Node ecosystem as it exists today is a lot of the tooling that you need to be productive, like a linter, a formatter, a test runner, lots of these different tools that where, in a Node project, you're usually installing, a dozen or more dependencies before you even get started. A lot of those things have kind of been rolled into the Deno runtime itself. So there's a formatter built in, a linter built in. There's even utility to compile your Deno program into a cross-platform executable. So a lot of the sort of key developer tools that you'll tend to need in every project are included out of the box in Deno. Another thing that Deno does that is unique to JavaScript runtimes is providing kind of granular controls over the execution environment of your code. So by default, your code doesn't actually have access to the file system or the system environment or the network. You as the developer kind of have to opt in to letting your code have access to those things. So say you're running in a secure CI environment and you don't want, your code and any, dependencies that you're bringing in to have access to environment variables, say, you can execute your code with the least number of, privileges possible within the underlying execution environment. So that runtime security by default is also something that's unique to Deno. So it's a JavaScript runtime. It's built on Rust in Tokyo. It's quite fast, especially sort of in comparison to similar like HTTP handling operations that exist in Node. And we hope provides just a really nice developer experience that's a little more, batteries included than something that you might have in Node today.
I have to ask because you just mentioned that. What is Tokyo? I'm familiar with Rust, obviously, but I'm not familiar with Tokyo. What is that?
Tokyo is a Rust library for doing asynchronous I/O operations. So in Node, they have libuv, which kind of provides a similar set of functionality, and Tokyo is it's the library to provide a similar set of functionality in Rust.
Interesting. So listening to your description, I think it might be best summed up as Deno is Node done right. Would that be a
Possibly. I
fair
mean,
take?
certainly was kind of envisioned in that way of like, if we were to recreate Node and kind of with the context that we have today, Deno is kind of the attempt at doing that.
I don't know if I'd call it that indicates that Node was done wrong. I think it's maybe a better description. Say Node is done with what was available at the time, and now there's a lot of other things available and better ways to do things. So let's use those.
15 years is a long time in tech, lots of things to learn.
Yeah.
And it's not just that. I mean, Node kind of paved the way. So a lot of things, were created in an ad hoc kind of a way. And, you don't always have all the context and all the information. And by the time you have a better understanding of what it is that you actually want to do or the way that it should be done, people are already using whatever you've created. And much like the web itself, there are no backsies.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like the success of Node and NPM just has like enshrined a lot of those patterns that we kind of take for granted in doing server-side JavaScript today. And CommonJS is one of those examples, right? Like there wasn't a web standard module API in 20 what was it? It would have been like 2010 when like Node was still originally being created. And so CommonJS was one of the ideas that was floating around that they implemented. And it's just we've kind of standardized in certain directions, or like we've learned things, or created new technology that didn't exist in those days.
By the way,
I think the no backsies is.
Oh, go for it.
I was just going to say, I think the no backsies is really the best way of putting it. Where, it's not that Node couldn't innovate in the ways that Deno is. It's more that they had all of this stuff that had kind of been built onto it over time that people relied on. And I mean, we see this in all kinds of stuff, including the ECMAScript standard, right? They don't kill stuff off, at least not very often. And so, you have these people that rely on this stuff, and yeah, you can't pull it back. And so the only way to move forward, kind of like what Angular did way back in the day, right? Moving from 1 to 2. Except they just kept the name and confused a bunch of people, and it caused some issues for them. But yeah, it's the same idea where it's, okay, we need to move forward in these ways, but we can't do it without breaking compatibility in the background.
I think another great example of that is the use of promises and the sync await. If you look at the Node APIs, most of them were created, at least the fundamental ones were created before promises were a thing, and certainly before the JavaScript language had built in a sync await. So it uses different patterns. It uses patterns like callbacks and stuff like that. And with Deno, I believe much of the APIs, especially because it is trying to use modern web APIs whenever possible, a lot of these APIs are promise based, like fetch. Uh,
Yeah. I mean, and since like Node, of course, like a lot of the core APIs also provide a promise-based interface that's sort of been grafted over the top of the callback-based interfaces. But yeah, I mean, a lot of those, the web standard APIs like Fetch are available. The and ECMAScript language features that do appear in Node, and they will filter their way into into Node over time too. Will usually show up in Deno first. Like for example, like top level async await is something that you can do in Deno, which I think is behind a flag in Node. I'd have to actually double check. I'm not sure if it's available with a flag or in some other context. But yeah, so like these sort of bleeding edge ECMAScript language features will tend to make their way into Deno a little faster as well.
Now, one of the things that Node or Deno, sorry, created when it came about. By the way, just if our listeners didn't notice, aren't aware, Deno is literally Node spelled backwards, right? That's the point of the name.
Yes, that is kind of where it came from. It's actually like if you were to sort the characters in Node, that is how you get Deno.
Oh, cool. One of the things that you also introduced in Deno, as I recall, is like a quote unquote standard library, a collection of JavaScript or TypeScript utility functions and objects and classes and whatnot that can be used in the code. And if one of the things, by the way, that I find kind of unfortunate is that it seems that this standard library did not make its way out of Deno into the JavaScript community at large. I would have loved to see a lot of this functionality just generally available everywhere.
Yeah, so the Deno standard library, at least until recently, was largely mostly usable in Deno. There are ways to use it outside of the context of Deno. With the advent of JSR, which is a registry, I don't know if we'll get into it, in this sort of conversation. The standard library has been published on JSR now as well, and since JSR modules can be used in any runtime environment, the Deno standard library is now kind of available in Node or in your ES build code for that you create for the browser or in Bun. So a lot of that stuff kind of has been freed from a Deno specific packaging.
That's excellent. I really hope that something like that library can become more than a quote unquote standard library, an actual standard library for JavaScript / ECMAScript / TypeScript. That would be awesome. It just provides a lot of useful functionality that a lot of people end up recreating themselves on as a one-off basis.
Yeah, for sure. Hopefully that'll start to make its way out a little bit. As as people start, adopting JSR for other purposes too.
Now, you mentioned that one of the reasons that Deno can do all this stuff and kind of, introduced all these innovations is the fact that unlike Node that has to contend with all the legacy packages and legacy code and legacy functionality, you had the ability to do a fresh start. I guess in many ways, Ryan kind of decided to do Deno because he understood that he can't do everything that he wants to do on the existing Node code base. So my question then is, like, one of the primary reasons that people use Node is because of this compatibility that it has with all these existing modules and applications and whatnot. And in many ways, they kind of depend on all this, like, not necessarily specified behavior that's built into Node,
Yeah.
and not necessarily documented, like they depend on the bugs. So the question is, oh, you kind of, if I understand correctly, you kind of need to compete with that. I mean, sure, if I'm starting a new project from scratch, then maybe I pick Deno, but then maybe I'm risking the fact that the package that I really want to use is not available for Deno. So how do I contend with that?
Yeah, it's definitely been like the major challenge at the core of like how Deno has evolved. I would say, like over the last 5 years, is like the gravitational pull of the npm ecosystem is pretty strong, and there's just a lot of tooling and libraries that exist there that are kind of non-optional in server-side JavaScript development today. So a lot of work on the Deno team these days goes into our node compatibility layer, where yes, with Deno's design, we do want to maintain an environment where we do use ECMAScript modules only, and we don't, support CommonJS, as a like outside of this compatibility layer. And we do want to favor, web standard APIs whenever possible. But the fact that, like, the sort of reality is that a lot of the Node ecosystem is necessary if you want to be, if you would like to be productive in server-side JavaScript today. So the node compatibility layer in Deno allows you to use just about any package that exists in npm. Like we have shim APIs available for most of Node core, which then enables a lot of the npm ecosystem to function on Deno. It is slightly different because the way in which you'd depend on a package could be a little different in Deno than it was in Node. But we've also like implemented a lot of compatibility features, like, by default in Deno, when you import a JavaScript file, you have to include the extension of that file. And that's for a couple of reasons. Number one, like in the browser, if you're importing a file, like you always include the extension of the file. So that's kind of where that design pattern came from. It's also slightly more efficient because, instead, if you leave off the file extension, then the runtime has to do a bunch of checking to see, like, are you actually trying to import a TSX file, a TS file, like a JS file? Like, and there's a lot of sort of overhead that comes along with that. But Deno provides a mode that is cheekily probably named sloppy imports, which is like an option that you can pass into the runtime, which is tolerant of more node style imports that leave off the extension. And with a combination of some of these compatibility features, you can take a lot of code that was originally written for Node.js and run it in Deno without really having to change much of anything. And the big push for us for Deno 2.0 for this year is like getting to the point where we feel like the vast majority of the most important Node packages just work in Deno. And I don't know if we'll ever, like, our goal isn't explicitly to get to like being a drop-in replacement for Node necessarily, but we want Next.js to work on Deno. Like, we want, all the web frameworks that you would want to use from the Node ecosystem to work really well on Deno as well. So that's probably our biggest like engineering objective, like over the next several months, is just continuing to improve like the set of compatibility features that we have for some of those undocumented features. Like, when you npm install a module to Node modules, the npm clients have certain behavior as far as like how those modules are unpacked, which then other modules depend on. Like, I think like if you install Tailwind, it expects like post CSS or something to have been already installed, and it actually introspects the contents of the Node modules folder to do some things to use that dependency. So the Node ecosystem is just kind of full of these little nooks and crannies and like strange behaviors that have been built on top of that we're, trying to find the best way as possible to like support those while still providing like the DX that we want to provide through Deno.
You know what this kind of reminds me of? It kind of reminds me of the Windows world. A lot of our listeners might be too young to remember that, but for a long time, when Windows was like the primary platform for which software was being written, Windows itself had all these bugs going from version to version, and they literally had to, when they created a new version of Windows, maybe even using a different technology, they often had to actually emulate buggy behavior just in order to make sure that older software continued to run. Because if you upgraded your Windows and all of a sudden your favorite game stopped working, you would blame Microsoft, not the game creator.
Yeah, I was going to say I had to run TIE Fighter in Windows 95 compatibility mode for a long time until I found like a more modern port of it that I could use otherwise.
So, but I do have to ask. I mean, if you're putting in all this effort, and it seems like a huge amount of effort into emulating Node on top of Deno, as it were, to an extent, then like, why do I want to go with emulation? Why shouldn't I just pick the original? What's the main benefit for me as a back-end JavaScript developer or a full stack JavaScript developer of using Deno over Node, especially if I do assume that I want to be using, all this functionality that exists and not write everything from scratch?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons. The first one is probably just reducing kind of the startup costs and complexity of your project, where like you do have TypeScript built in by default, you have the tester, linter, formatter, all of those like tools available out of the box. So the developer experience of like not having to manage those things and being able to keep your code a little leaner and not have quite so many third-party dependencies is potentially somewhat attractive. Also, like a lot of the libraries that you use in Node today probably are just like a little bit faster on Deno. So like if an Express server that you wrote in Node is just going to be probably a little bit faster in Deno than it is running on Node. And kind of there's a lot of contextual things there for like which packages and what set of maybe middlewares you're using. But I just actually saw a post like over the weekend about, there's a HTTP framework called Oak, which is like a middleware framework sort of inspired by Koa. And the author tested it across, Bun and Node and Deno to kind of see what the performance characteristics were. And Deno and Bun were, about the same. Bun was actually ran HTTP requests slightly faster. It was like a maybe 10% increase in overall throughput, but both were like twice as fast as Node. So I think there's kind of some things that you get for free by switching to Deno as well.
And you were able to keep or maintain this performance benefit even when adding the backward compatibility with Node? I mean, that would seem to be the challenge. I would imagine that with Node, improving performance in a lot of places kind of runs smack dab into the problem of maintaining backward compatibility.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly challenges with that, but I mean, the shim APIs that we've created for like the underlying HTTP, Node core APIs utilize the same sort of or they get to benefit from the same optimizations we've made in Deno to make HTTP request handling fast. So those shim APIs do tend to perform pretty well. So like we, have been doing some testing with web frameworks like Astro, say, and just using the sort of Node adapter for Astro, which enables like server-side rendering of pages in that framework. Those Node APIs actually run slightly faster on Deno for server-side rendering than they do in Node, and I think it's just because of the underlying infrastructure being being slightly more performant, not necessarily because Deno is intrinsically always faster than Node. It's just that And it's not like, Node couldn't be this fast. Potentially, C is certainly, just as fast as Rust or C++ or whatever. But it's just a lot of work has gone into optimizing the HTTP interfaces at Deno.
I think it's also legitimate, I would say, for the performance improvements to be. So, I'll put it differently. It's okay for the shims to run slower if the code that doesn't need the shims can run faster. If you understand what I'm trying to say. So, as long as I don't need some weird node functionality for backward compatibility, the standard stuff, if that runs faster, I'm happy with that, even if the shims themselves like pay a certain price. Um, but I wanted to ask something about the built-in TypeScript support that you mentioned before. So I actually posted a link in our chat to a great quote from Matteo Collina, who's really deep in the Node world, by the way. He's one of the
Yeah, for
maintainers,
sure.
I think, of Node. And he wrote a tweet recently, which was really amusing and eye-opening to an extent, which is TypeScript does not exist. There's a multiverse of TypeScript implementations depending on the permutation of the configs. And he added also to that, this kind of weirdness are the key reasons why I'm still skeptical about TypeScript. Now, I'm not skeptical about TypeScript, but I definitely appreciate what he said. The fact that the different values that you put in your tsconfig file can significantly impact the functionality, the behavior of TypeScript. Or put another way, kind of means that TypeScript is less than of a language standard and more of a utility that you can configure, uh, in a sense. So my question is, how does Deno deal with that? I mean, is it using the same tsconfig as TypeScript, or as TSC, or something else? How does that work?
I mean, there's a sort of I think like what Matteo is saying is correct, right? Like the configurability of TypeScript does introduce a lot of different permutations of how TypeScript can behave. One, I think, benefit in the context of Deno is that there is a set of behavior that's sort of codified in how TypeScript runs on Deno. So there isn't sort of an unlimited amount of configurability for like compiler options and stuff like that. There certainly is some, and there are some, of those configuration options that do still work in Deno, but the TypeScript environment is relatively predictable versus in Node, where you do have like kind of full configurability of how the TSK or like how TSC works at the end of the day. So but like the point stands that if you have access to all those compiler options, it makes it very difficult to write TypeScript code that can predictably run with every set of compiler options.
So am I
And
stuck then with how you did it then?
To a degree, right? Like, so there are certain things that are configurable. There are certain things that are not. So there's probably features of like tsconfig that would work in a Node environment that are impossible in Deno, just because we don't support those options. So it is a constraint that exists for sure.
by the way, not supporting some tsconfig options is actually a good thing, because I've literally seen projects that were configured in such a way that interface definitions weren't each actually even being used, and the developers didn't even notice. So like
Oh,
there
wow.
were incorrect types, and literally types with errors in them, and the project seemed to compile fine because everything that was using like an unrecognized, the imports didn't actually work, and anything that used an interface that wasn't specified defaulted to any instead. So they basically had everything as any, but they thought they were writing TypeScript, but actually had everything as any, which is like the worst of all possible worlds.
Yeah, so all the overhead of using TSC with none of the actual compile time safety. Yeah, that seems suboptimal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So if you're prevented from being able to do that, I would definitely count that as a good thing. But what is the actual benefit of having the TypeScript functionality built into the environment? I mean, or let's put it differently. With TypeScript, I see two main benefits. One is while I'm writing the code in the development environment, in let's say VS Code, it does all the type checking for me, the squiggly lines, the completion, stuff like that, and highlights files that have errors in them and so forth. The other advantage is the actual compilation step to an extent, because if I have errors in my type errors in my code and not too funky tsconfig settings, then the build step will actually fail if I try to build something bad. So because I'm ignoring squiggly lines in VS Code for some reason. So my question is, with Deno, you don't need that build step, or you don't have that build step. So am I maybe kind of even losing some benefits of TypeScript by working this way? And alternatively, what are the advantages of working this way?
Actually, so there is still a build step that happens. Like, so there's a Rust-based sort of equivalent of TSC, which we would use sort of at runtime to generate the JavaScript code. Because like Deno runs JavaScript code in V8, similar to how Node does. So we still do need to transpile TypeScript before it's able to run in that environment, because V8 doesn't natively understand TypeScript. So there is a sort of build step that happens as a result of running your code on Deno. It's just that it is opaque in that, like, to you as a developer, it doesn't seem like you need to handle that, even though it is happening for you behind the scenes. I think the advantage of having TypeScript built in largely comes from how you get to manage your source code. So, you can version control TypeScript, and you can, in the case of, JSR, you can publish TypeScript directly to the registry. Other TypeScript developers don't have to rely on your transpiled code. They could actually import TypeScript source code that you have written into their project, should they need to. So being able to just actually manage your code base as TypeScript without having to think about transpilation as a part of that ends up being kind of nice in a lot of different contexts.
So it's basically reducing friction in the development process.
Yeah, kind of friction, kind of the overhead of that transpilation process. Like you kind of don't have to consider it within your workflow.
So side note really quick, am I the only one that thinks of vegetable juice when I hear V8?
There was a time, I think I've gotten over
I should have had a
Think
V8.
about nice cars.
Yeah. Or yeah. V8
I think,
car too.
I should have had a V8 commercials for those who are too young to remember that. Anyway.
Yeah, but it's TypeScript is not the only thing that you built in. I think you mentioned it, that you've also got like a testing framework built in. You've got a linter built in. Can you elaborate about these a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, so Deno has like a test command that's built in. If you run like Deno help after you install Deno, you can get a sense of like what all these command line tools are. But yeah, it was really about like there's a lot of decisions that you make when you're bootstrapping a Node project that aren't really that important, like which test framework you use. Possibly not that important, which linter you use and what your linter settings are, what your formatter settings are. Probably also not important. Like you can kind of bike shed on these things if that is your preference. But also, I just think that accepting a set of defaults tends to be kind of nice. One thing that I've really noticed is as I've gone between different Deno projects, because the testing framework is the same, because the linter settings are the same, and the formatter settings are the same, like it's much less jarring to kind of go from one Deno project to the next, because like the lay of the land is pretty similar. So like having this sort of similarity is useful to you as a developer, because it takes like kind of trivial decisions out of your hands. You certainly could use other test frameworks if you want, but you don't necessarily have to make those decisions, and it helps you kind of go from one project to the next. I used to use Ruby on Rails for a long time, and that was one thing that was kind of nice about a lot of those projects was I knew the models were in this folder, and like a lot of those conventions kind of helped me like navigate those projects, even if I was relatively new to them. Like Rails projects can be very, diverse in a lot of other ways, but like some of that similarity is helpful. In terms of like the other tools that are built in, I mentioned Deno compile, which you can point at a TypeScript source code file, and it generates a binary that can be run cross-platform. So like it's a good way to kind of compartmentalize like a web server, say, into just a binary that you can run on an arbitrary server somewhere. Or if you're making a command line utility, it's a really easy way to create like a cross-platform command line utility. So T, which is the package manager that was replacing Homebrew, or like the original author of Homebrew used Deno to create T, which is kind of his sort of next generation version of that package manager. And he used Deno for this reason, actually, because he wanted to write TypeScript, wasn't necessarily interested in having that transpilation step, and the ability of Deno to package up a cross-platform executable was convenient there as well. So Deno compile, super useful. Certainly a few other nice. So there's Deno doc, which is also a built-in utility, and you can point it at a TypeScript file or a .d.ts file, and it will kind of introspect those files and generate HTML documentation for your for your TypeScript source or from your type configuration. So so there ends up being kind of a lot in the box, which is pretty nice.
By the way, does your TypeScript implementation also support JSDoc?
Yes, it does. So cool. That's kind of where it's pulling a lot of that. It'll pull documentation content from JSDoc comments if they exist, and it can guess a lot just from type information as well.
AJ would be happy. So I'm old enough to remember the Unix days. That the whole point was, one of the big selling points was that a lot of those built commands that were built into other operating systems in the Unix world were implemented as separate executables and ran as distinct userland processes, and weren't really built into Unix itself. But now it seems like with you and with Bun that everything is kind of being built into the main, to that single executable. Like Deno with one command line switch does one thing, with a different command line switch does some other thing. What's the motivation? What's the advantage of bundling all this functionality? Some of which could definitely be like distinct and standalone. I mean, like the test runner. Now, like, what's the benefit of having it built into that same executable and not being split off into a separate executable file?
I think like it's kind of you're deciding where and when to manage complexity within your project. Like if you are using some kind of utility in userland, the complexity that comes along with that is keeping that dependency up to date, and whatever plumbing needs to happen to kind of pipe the input and output from like one utility into the next. And the Unix philosophy is definitely one of the reasons that like operating system has been so popular and continues to be like one of the best options for especially like technical technical use cases, or like running code on servers, that sort of thing. But the price that you pay in like a application programming tool, like something that's a little higher level, like a Deno or a Node or a Bun, is that the things that you will tend to need over and over again, you have to sort of reinvent every single time you create a new project. And the overhead of the startup costs and maintaining a package.json that has 12 dependencies in it, none of which are actually have anything to do with the functionality or a project. It's just like the tooling that you need to actually build your code, test your code, lint your code, that sort of thing. There's a price that comes with that as well. There's certainly flexibility, but when you consider the trade-offs of like, okay, I have, this dependency on jest, and it depends on this other thing. And now when I run, npm install, I get these conflicts that I have to kind of work my way through, and then I have to upgrade this dependency, et cetera. So like taking dependencies out of the mix reduces the like maintenance complexity in a pretty meaningful way that I think is kind of worth the trade-off, at least in this instance. But there's certainly arguments to be made the other way that, a lot of these utilities certainly could be user land tools and evolve separately. But because they're kind of core to any application that's non-trivial, including them as part of the platform tends to be a trade-off that helps.
So if I'm using Deno, then I likely won't install prettier and ESLint and TS-ESLint and stuff like that. I'll just use whatever is built in.
Yep, that is the intent, that you wouldn't necessarily have to bring those tools in, unless you're using Deno in the context of an existing Node project, in which case you might still, have those tools around. But in a Deno project, the expectation is you won't need to have those things.
Cool.
I'm kind of curious. I'm going to change gears on a little bit. How did you get into Deno? Right? What's your story here?
Yeah, so I've been a Node.js user since I think the first code I wrote was for 0.8 of Node. And at that time, I was working at a company called Twilio, which is like an API provider for like messaging, telephony, stuff like that. And Node was pretty new, and I was like, "Oh, Twilio, we should totally have like a client library for this Node thing. I think it has legs. I think it's going to go somewhere." So I wrote like a HTTP client wrapper for like the Twilio API in Node back in those days, and I kind of fell in love with it because like finally, my investment in JavaScript, I could now use JavaScript to program every kind of thing, like from servers to front end to robots, everything in between. So using JavaScript as kind of the lingua franca of web development has kind of kept me involved in server-side JavaScript for a long time. But I think like a lot of Node users, like over time, you started to get the feeling that Node had jumped the shark a little bit, where it's just like, I look at a standard Node project and I look at all these configuration files that I have without even having like written any code. Like there was certainly a certain amount of discontent with how much complexity it kind of crept into the ecosystem. So the prospect of having this set of decisions that are kind of trivial made for me was pretty compelling. And so like the lure of Deno as a technology kind of started from there, of like having this sense that, complexity had been creeping into Node, and the experience of using Deno was something where like once I used it once, I was like, okay, like I'll probably be a little grumpy, like if I have to use Node without Deno again, because like if I have to configure, tsconfig or webpack for these purposes again, like I'll probably be a little sad.
Wait a minute. You mentioned Webpack. Maybe you mentioned it before and I kind of missed it, but does that mean that Deno also has a built-in bundler?
So there was a built-in bundler that was deprecated in a previous version of Deno. It's something that we're kind of looking at again, but like ES build works pretty well in the Deno ecosystem, like for that purpose. So it hasn't been like super high priority. But the Webpack as like a way of running like transpiling server-side code even was something that I had to contend with, at least in my projects that were using Node. So like compiling like SCSS, say, like as a part of those projects. So a lot of those tools I find I need to use less in Deno.
Which go for it, Chuck. Sorry.
I was going to push us back to the story just a little bit.
Yeah.
So it wasn't any one particular project. It was just kind of your workflow that pushed you toward Deno, it sounds like. I guess my other question is, and I'm always curious about this, is right now you're actually working for the organization that gives us Deno. How did that come about? Was it just your involvement in the project, or was there something else? Did you know someone?
I've been sort of around the project for some amount of time, but they decided they wanted to like have a formal DevRel program, and I actually wasn't aware of it. But somebody from the team reached out to me and was like, "Hey, we're looking at doing a DevRel program. Is this something you'd be interested in?" And I was like, yeah, I totally would be interested," because I had been pretty stoked about the technology for a while. So it kind of came through some outreach from the company at the time.
Okay, cool.
If I'm pulling us back a little bit towards the technology side, it seems that more and more Node in the context of full stack applications will be running in the context of some sort of meta framework. Like it won't be, you might not be using Node or on its own. You might be using it with a Next.js or an Astro or, whatever. Uh, and so my question is, how does Deno fit into this kind of brave new world of meta frameworks that are full stack? Does it just work out of the box? Like when I install Next.js, how how does Deno fit into that installation process?
So there's kind of a spectrum of how well Deno works with a lot of the meta frameworks in the Node ecosystem. But even just within, if you're just talking about like first party like Deno frameworks, you will probably be using some kind of meta framework along with Deno. Fresh is kind of the first party one that the Deno team maintains, which is sort of designed to run on edge servers and implements like an island architecture similar to Astro and other. There's a lot of other frameworks doing it in that way, but the assumption is that zero JavaScript is sent to the client by default, and we push more rendering to the server. So certainly that's one of the options. Another meta framework that works really well in Deno.
By the way, just before you move on to to another one,
Yeah,
correct me if I'm wrong. I think that Fresh is kind of built on Preact, right?
it is. Yeah. So actually, one of the maintainers of Preact, Marvin Hagemeister, is a member of the Deno team now, and is kind of
Cool.
the primary maintainer of Fresh as well. So yeah, Preact definitely a core technology there. Yeah, and then if for other, I mean, there's certainly other meta frameworks that you can use in Deno. The other like notable one I'd point out is Hono, which is maintained by the Cloudflare team. Actually, is sort of like the spiritual successor, I would say, to like Express and Sinatra from the Ruby world, where I've found Hono to scale up like pretty nicely. So it can start from like single file web servers. And it actually scales up to reasonably complex use cases pretty well. So Hono and Fresh are probably two of the best options that exist, just that work natively in Deno. But from the Node ecosystem, that's like one of the big challenges that we're trying to address with Deno 2 is getting more of those meta frameworks to work really well in Deno. Some of them work pretty well today. So like if you were to, a lot of the frameworks that use Vite as a build toolchain under the covers. So like Astro would be one of them, SvelteKit. Nuxt would be another. Those frameworks tend to work pretty well in Deno because Vite works quite well for the most part in Deno. So a lot of those build steps work mostly out of the box. Like there's some edge cases depending on like which parts of the ecosystem you're trying to leverage. There might be plugins that may or may not work, but like the node adapter. So Astro has this concept of adapters, which allow server-side rendering in different environments, like in Cloudflare Workers or Node or whatever it would happen to be. And there is a Deno Astro adapter, which is a little bit out of repair, and that's largely my fault. I haven't had a chance to update the adapter yet, but the Node adapter for Astro works great, and you can use that today. There's a SvelteKit adapter for Node that works great in Deno today. There's also like a community maintained SvelteKit adapter that is natively Deno that works really well. Nuxt is in a kind of a similar position. So a lot of those types of frameworks do work really well. Next.js is kind of a different beast though, and it kind of leverages a lot of behavior in Node that we have not been able to model like one-to-one in such a way where like Next is a good experience specifically. But that is an obsession that currently exists on the Deno team, is to figure out how to make Next run really well as well. So certainly a goal.
Yeah, that's kind of important. I mean, not putting down any of the other frameworks, but just numbers wise, Next.js is more or less like as big as all the other meta frameworks combined. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely not lost on the crew here at Deno for sure. Is the necessity to have a acceptable experience there. So I think we'll get there. But that is like a big project for us right now, and something that we're kind of gating our 2.0 launch on, is like how well we feel that we support those crucial meta frameworks from Node.
Yeah, I guess you could say it's the next big thing, right, Dan?
You could.
I was going to make the same pun.
Well played, Steve. Well played.
Yeah, and especially given that I work.
What's next? But anyway.
Yeah, and especially given that I work at a company called Next Insurance that has nothing to do with Next.js, except that we actually do use it in for But anyway,
is it time for the next question yet? I mean,
yeah. I think we're starting to approach the end of our show, and it seems like we're not really going to be able to cover JSR this time. So we probably will need to invite you over again to talk about it.
Yeah,
one thing that I want to kind of ask you about before we wrap up is something that you kind of alluded to multiple times during the conversation, and that's the edge computing story. I think there is this is one of your strengths, I believe, the ability to run on the edge. How do you differ in Node in that regard? Do you differ from Node? What are the advantages of running Deno in that scenario? What are the advantages of the edge in general? So go for it.
Yeah, sure. We can try to unpack that a little bit. So the one thing that is useful about how Deno works is a lot of the core functionality in Deno is based on like web standard APIs that are available in the browser. And that becomes important because when you're running JavaScript on the server on the edge, you are running it in a V8 isolate, which you want to be able to sort of spin up and tear down very quickly. And that's kind of one of the primary advantages of running JavaScript on the edge, is that instead of a virtual machine that needs to be sort of spun up and spun down, like with a Lambda, say, or like or like another container hosting solution, a JavaScript environment can manage a pool of V8 isolates. Similar to like a browser tab in your browser, which are very sort of cheap and easy to create and tear down. So the cold start times for those isolates can be really nice in a lot of scenarios. And the fact that Deno can run really well in a lightweight JavaScript environment like that one is one of the advantages that sort of makes it work well in that scenario. So Deno is being used in sort of edge functions in a few different contexts. So like if you use Netlify edge functions, that actually runs on Deno and Deno's cloud infrastructure sort of behind the scenes. For a long time, Supabase's edge functions also ran on our cloud infrastructure. They've since like taken Deno and created their own edge infrastructure based on Deno that they're building on as well, which is awesome. They've been doing some really cool work there with the open source runtime. So there's, I think it's the relationship between like Deno being able to run really well in a browser-like environment and the fact that you need to be able to run those lightweight V8 isolates on the edge maybe makes it ideally suited for those environments. And then I think like the advantage generally of doing, processing on the server on the edge is latency. So if you can do compute tasks and on servers that are geographically close to your users. That's going to result in faster round trips. There can be like data residency requirements that can be satisfied potentially through where your code executes. There's other like types of functionality that can be that is maybe optimally done on the edge, like whether it's like manipulating headers for an HTTP request or like doing image processing. There's scenarios in which being able to execute that logic close to users is important. Or if you're doing have like an application architecture that leans heavily on server side rendering, doing that server side rendering on edge servers can be beneficial as well. So not every request to generate dynamic HTML has to go to like a data center in Virginia. You can do that maybe a little closer to where your users are.
The one thing that you really need to be careful about is the latency of your access to the data. Because if you're running compute on the edge, but your data is still back at the data center, you might actually end up hurting performance rather than improving it, because you may significantly increase the latency of data access. So you really need to think about that aspect of your solution or implementation.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's you're starting to see like more database vendors and those types of services popping up where they're sort of natively designed to be accessed from edge servers, which is cool. But it is certainly one of the architectural concerns that you have to think through.
Now, one more question that I have is this. So it's Deno.com, which means that you're an actual company. You're not just an open source project, right? So how do you plan to be like, to make money, to be to make sure that the project survives and the company doesn't go under? Like what's the value proposition in terms of generating generating funds?
Yeah. So it's the place where we found success so far is around like that edge computing infrastructure. So the one of the paid offerings that Deno, the company, has today is something called sub-hosting, which is a way to like sort of take untrusted code and execute it within like a cloud environment. So like I used to work at Twilio, and Twilio has this thing called Twilio Functions, which is like you can give Twilio a chunk of JavaScript code and it'll run that JavaScript code whenever you get an incoming text message or phone call or whatever. And there's actually a lot of SaaS platforms or developer tool platforms that want to offer this functionality where we'll execute some code for you when this integration event or this other event happens somewhere in our system. And Deno has a platform for very quickly building that out, kind of based on this edge computing infrastructure that we created for Deno Deploy, which is a like an edge function hosting platform, which is sort of generally available to anyone you can run full web applications on it or specifically edge functions. So I think like the cloud infrastructure is where a lot of the like revenue growth is going to be in the future. But like the open source runtime and also JSR, which we'll talk about next time, are both like free and open source and will be that way sort of indefinitely. And we think like those two things being successful as open source projects will be a headwind for some of like the cloud-based stuff that we think will support the company.
So just to make sure that I understand, just to make sure that I understand, in a sense, you're kind of competing with Cloudflare workers, like providing an alternative to their solution.
The edge hosting infrastructure is kind of in the similar space to workers. The sub-hosting API that I talked about for running untrusted code also is kind of in the same space. Like Cloudflare has a like an enterprise offering in that realm. I don't know if it's self-serviced yet, but there's like a workers for enterprise or workers for platforms or something, I think it's called, that does a similar thing. So that's probably the nearest competitive solution. And I think like Deno and Cloudflare are kind of the two ways you can do edge compute these days. Like Workers and Deno deploy are kind of the only game in town. So like Vercel edge functions say like uses Workers under the hood today. So yeah, so it is kind of similar to that solution.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah, very cool.
Yep. If you could tell us here within like 2 minutes, because I do have a hard stop at 10:30 Mountain Time. 2 minutes. What's coming next in Deno?
Yeah. So as I kind of have alluded to, like node compatibility is a huge focus for the team right now. So increasing the amount of the node ecosystem that runs with no configuration within Deno is kind of the biggest engineering goal in front of us for the Deno runtime itself. The other bits that are coming out are continued improvement of integration with JSR and tooling around like publishing to the JSR registry and making JSR like work really well across every runtime from Bun to Deno to Node to Cloudflare workers and browsers and everything in between. So I think node compatibility and JSR are going to be the continued focus for us.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's go ahead and do our picks and then we'll wrap up. Steve, what are your picks?
Oh, we're going to start with the high point first. Okay. So real quick, before I get to the real high point, blog post interesting one I saw on Hacker News today regarding the classic and long-running debate of tabs versus spaces. And the title of the blog post is New Data Shows Tabs Are More Popular Than Spaces, but Spaces Users Are Happier. And so what it is there's a company that surveyed the Lunduke Journal, Lunduke, and surveyed 7,200 IT professionals and computer nerds. And they asked all kinds of questions about what they use and then tried to associate tabs users versus spaces users with other things such as which text editors do they use, what OSs do they use, what web browsers do they use, and is there any correlation with age and politics and so on and so forth. It's really sort of entertaining. So I found it quite interesting.
I just put a link in our chat about the white space programming language. Are you familiar with it?
Well, I know what.
You mean Python?
Sort of like
Are you talking
Python?
about Python?
Are you talking about Python?
White space is an actual programming language that just uses white space characters for programming. So it uses all the instructions are coded as spaces, tabs, new lines, and stuff like that. And the advantage is that you can write your code within the file of some other programming language's code. So you can have like two programs in the same source file. It might be interesting if Deno had built-in support for the whitespace programming language.
Oh man,
that way
they'll get right on that, right?
Yeah, exactly. We'll file that away as a high priority issue for sure.
Yeah, I'm going to guess that if you're writing with white spaces, you always have to use the dark background, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Right. Okay, and now for the dad jokes of the week. So, in past years, I've done, a lot of interviewing of job candidates, and it's usually me asking the questions, but this recent guy I was interviewing and we were talking about money and he said, well, what does a competitive salary even mean? I said, well, it just means that your salary is competing against your bills. Now
these days it's not as amusing. Let's put it this way. As it was, let's say 2 years ago.
Right. The bills are winning. Do you know that alligators can live to be up to 70 years old? That's why there's an increased chance that they will see you later.
All right. I like that one. That was a good one, actually.
See you later, alligator.
Yeah.
And then some deep thoughts for the day. If anybody remembers Jack Handy from Saturday Night Live. So what happens if you get scared to death twice? Is the S or the C silent in scent? And then finally, the same and similar, are they the same or are they similar?
It's like that old saying that in theory and practice are the same thing, but in practice they aren't.
Right. Exactly. Those are my picks of the week.
All right. You want to put that link to that article in the comments, and that way we can have people find it.
Yes.
All right, Dan, what are your picks?
Not a lot of picks this time. We've started watching a new TV series on Netflix. It's a really new one. It's called The Gentleman. It's an action comedy television series created by Guy Ritchie. And with Guy Ritchie, it can be hit or miss, but when it's a hit, it's a hit. So he created this kind of spin-off from his 2019 film that had the same name. So it's kind of the same sort of settings and characters. And so far, we're enjoying it quite a lot. We really only watched the first episode, but so far so good. It's like this guy that turns out that he's a duke. He inherited the title and the estate from his dad, and it turns out that it's actually the estate that his dad actually rented out the estate to the mob to pack weed there. They have like this huge weed factory on there, and he now has to deal with all these mob characters and whatnot. And it's and if you've seen Guy Ritchie's movies, kind of the setting and how the sort of characters that you encounter there, and so it's so far so good. We are really enjoying it so far. And I guess, one more thing is, I'm kind of clearing up my own like personal library at home, like actual books. Like we've gotten to the point that we had like 3 rows of books in the libraries, one behind the other, and it was kind of, things were starting to fall off the shelves. So I'm really getting rid of various books that I don't need anymore. And it's interesting to go through the books and decide which ones you want to keep and which one you give away to a library or whatever. And I'm thinking of maybe I think like a few years back, I did I one of some of my picks were about these old science fiction and fantasy books that people don't remember anymore. Some of them are really excellent. Now that I'm seeing those books again, maybe I'll revisit that as well. I'm just not prepared yet. So if you guys or listeners are interested in some excellent sci-fi books or fantasy books that you've probably haven't heard of before, then let me know and I'll do that. And those are my picks for today.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to jump in with picks now. Y'all know that I do board games as part of my picks, so I'll start out with that. A couple weeks ago, I went to a board game convention with a friend of mine, and we played a game called Apiary. Now, if you're familiar with the term apiary, it is about bees. Now, these aren't just any bees; these are space bees, which is kind of fun. And so the space bees are out there trying to build and explore. And so what you wind up doing is you're building around the space that your spaceship is on to be able to do more stuff. Now, this has a board game weight of 2.96. So it's a little bit on the complicated end of games. It was a lot of fun, and there were some things that I really liked about it. One of them is it kind of has that worker placement element that you see in a lot of other games where you have the little meeple that you put out, except this one is actually a bee. And whenever you bring the bee worker back, it actually increases in power. And then once it gets to 4 power, when you bring it back, it hibernates and goes back to 1 power. And so there's a mechanic where you're playing with putting the bees out, and only level 4 bees can do specific work. And so you're kind of balancing between building up your ship and the capabilities and bonuses you get from that, and getting the bees back so that you can do other things. You can also bump other bees off of spaces, which again sends them back to your hive and levels them up. and so you're trying to weigh out how much advantage you give to other players when you do that. It's a lot of fun, a lot of fun, and you build out the different spaces with different types of hex squares or hex spaces, which also makes sense since it's a B game. So I'm going to pick Apiary. It came out last year. It was one of the hottest games. It was one of the hardest games to get on and play at the board game convention, because they had was it 6? I think it was 8. They had 8 hot games you could go try out, and this was one of them, and it was one of the harder games to get on. The other one was the White Castle, and I'll probably pick that next week. But really enjoyed it. Challengers was another one of those games that I picked last time. So anyway, Apiary is my board game pick. I also, and this is a pick that I may see if I can get somebody on the podcast to talk about, but I found that I needed to automate some stuff off of a website. Essentially, just to give a little bit of context, Spreaker offered us a deal if we moved all of our podcasts over there. But the problem is that when they imported the RSS feed, what wound up happening was they set up their own pages for each of our episodes, and then instead of leaving the link to our website, they linked to theirs. And I told them that was a no-go, right? I was like, look, it has to link to our website or nothing. And so I still kind of want to move over because they have a lot better tools for putting the podcast sponsorships in, and they have a lot better number tools, and I can add all of my co-hosts on all the shows as collaborators on the podcast, so they can go look up the numbers on their own and things like that. So there are definite payoffs for this, but I need to fix that one thing. And so I tried using Mechanize because I mostly work in Ruby, but the problem is that their page is client-side rendered, and Mechanize doesn't play nice with those. So it's using React or something. I didn't really look too hard to figure that out. But Puppeteer in JavaScript does. And so I've been fiddling with that a bit and figuring out how to basically, I need it to download the RSS feed, and then, which is just an XML file, right? Have it parse out the location, and then navigate the website, because they don't have an API to stick that URL in. And if I can get that figured out, then I can migrate the shows over. So unless they find me a solution before then. But anyway, so I'm going to pick Puppeteer. It's pretty cool. Kevin, what are your picks?
Nice. So from the category of Netflix shows, I've been watching House of Ninjas recently, which is about a family of ninjas who kind of gave up their shinobi lifestyle, are trying to live as a normal family in Japan, but end up getting kind of sucked back into the world of, ninja intrigue, which it's an imported show with subtitles. It is dubbed, but the dub is pretty bad. So I would recommend going with the.
I never watch the dubbed things if I can help it.
No, yeah, the dub is not great. But the dad jokes from earlier reminded me of a story about a king once who loved grass. He loved the smell of grass, everything about it. So he summoned his royal builder to his castle and said, I want you to rebuild my castle in grass. And the builder was very skeptical, but she said, okay, I'll rebuild your castle in grass. So she created this massive castle, all made out of grass. The king loved it. And, she stored all of the old stuff from the prior castle, like up above the main throne room. But the first day that the king was holding court in his grass castle, he was actually crushed by his previous throne, which fell through the grass ceiling because grass is not very good at bearing weight. And the moral of the story, of course, is that people in grass houses shouldn't stow thrones.
Okay.
That is so good. Thank you. I always love it when the guests bring the jokes. It's so good.
Yep. All right,
Yeah, I'm
Kevin,
sure that people
want
to not be as grateful, but yeah, that's okay.
If people want to connect with you, where do they find you on the internet?
I'm at Kevin Whinnery on Twitter, or just K Whinnery on GitHub. Would love it if you would hang out on the Deno Discord as well. It's discord.gg/Deno. So feel free to join us there. But yeah, those are probably the big ones.
Awesome. All right. We'll wrap it up
So-
here.
So we really
go ahead.
just need to bring Kevin over again to talk about JSR. That's
Yep.
I
that's
think so.
the
Yeah,
update.
would love to chat about that more.
Yeah,
Yeah,
please
let's do it. All right, folks. Till next time, Max out.
Bye.
Adios.
Later, folks.